So with these dates that I'm going to be gone, when we get back, there's going to be 2 weeks of class, and then we're done with this section. And then we're going to take off for Christmas and start again in January. And so we have the 3 weeks off and then just 2 weeks on. When I first started looking at the lesson today, I was like, I want to try to squeeze everything in, but no, it's too much. And so we'll have the 2 classes afterwards. And then one other thing, just to let you guys know, like my New Testament class is less developed than the Old Testament class. I've gone through the Old Testament class probably like
dark water, Pepsi.
Wow. Dark water.
Something I don't drink.
Thank you. But because of that, as I'm going through these lessons, I'm actually revamping them. The Old Testament class, I didn't have to revamp much at all because I've gone through it a number of times and tweaked them. And so an idea that I had for this lesson next time, because I know some of you may say, man, I wish we would have done that, is to actually go through a chronological, as best as possible, chronological map of Jesus' ministry and where he went and any significance of those locations. Unfortunately, I didn't think about doing that until it was too late to do it for tonight. So, but I'm going to try to remember to do that before I teach this again.
Real quick on the chronological for Jesus. How would you do that? I don't know. The Gospels. I think it's hard to discern chronologically. Just looking at the Gospels, how you would do it.
It's very hard to discern. It wouldn't be an exact chronology. The key thing is getting a general idea based on, like it says, he was in this area, so like kind of an idea that he was in there a while. And being able to see how he moved around. There are efforts at chronologies with when they've done taken the parallel Gospels and put them together and gone after those, so I could use one of those as a basis. It just wouldn't be authoritative.
Sure.
Main reason would be to give us the two senses, one of how he was traveling and moving, how far, and the other thing is to hit the different places and the significance of those locations in the whole history of Scripture. Now, in the original curriculum, I didn't cover a lot of the actual history of Jesus' ministry because it was 3 years long. In other words, there's not a lot of background history that happens in just 3 years. You think about this, the entire New Testament period, where it was from Jesus' ministry to when the last New Testament books were written, except with the possible exception of Revelation and some of the John's epistles, would fit into just the life of David. So think of how we only did like the one lesson on the life of David. So when you get to the background history, there's a lot more. We spread out some with the Roman history and stuff. But that's why I do the second half of this class, which is diving deep into the cultures of the first century. Because the New Testament is less history and more direct teaching and interacting with people within churches, knowing the cultures becomes more important and able to understand the New Testament. So that's why we tackle it in these two ways, kind of the political history and background and then the cultural history. So tonight we are covering the world of the Gospels. So what was going on during the time of the Gospels? Let me go ahead and close this. Next week we're going to kind of pick up where Acts picks up, and it's not a definite line there, but you get the basic idea. By way of review and such, we went over this chart last week, and we got to where Philip and Herod Antipas and Archelaus, they took over the kingdom that Herod had, and we at the very end we found out last week that Archelaus had basically been a very poor ruler and was removed, and he is replaced by a Roman governor. But the stuff we're talking about today is while these two here, Philip and Herod Antipas and the Roman governor, are ruling, and then next week we'll pick up with Herod Agrippa and Herod Agrippa II. In the New Testament, this is not in your notes. If you guys want a copy of this chart, I can make it for you. I handed it out though. I don't know if I did. Did I hand it? I don't know if I made it as available as a handout, but I brought this up in our sermon a while back when we dealt with the death of John the Baptist. Herodias is the one who is offended by John the Baptist and calls for his head when her daughter Salome dances for Herod Antipas, and he is very happy with how she dances, and so says, I'll give you anything that you want, and she's like, I want the head of John the Baptist. Now we read about Herodias, we don't know that much about her, but I just found it very intriguing to take this one woman and show the connections that she had in that ancient world. Her grandfather was Herod the Great, and her grandmother was Miriam, the Hasmonean princess that Herod ended up executing. They had Aristobulus and Alexander, remember the two sons that Herod ends up executing, so her father was one of those sons. Her mother, Bernice, she's the granddaughter her mother Bernice was close friends of Agrippina, who was the granddaughter of Augustus's wife, or Augustus, the wife of Germanicus, the mother of Gaius Caligula. So basically, Herodias' mother was very connected with the Caesars and such. Her grandmother on this side was Salome, the sister of Herod the Great. So basically, this grandmother got this grandmother killed by turning Herod against her. And this grandmother was married to Costobarus, who was the governor of Idumea under Herod, whom Herod also killed and had executed. And then her great-grandmother was Alexandra, who was very close friends with Cleopatra. And then her brother, Herod Agrippa, becomes Agrippa the Great, thanks much to her money, in fact. But he ends up being very connected. He befriends and knows two of the emperors. And then you have Agrippa II, who is the one who sat in on Paul's hearing. So she is connected to all of those with only just a few steps of relation. And so it's intriguing to see that. So the time period, if you guys got the chart books that I handed out, this is one of the last charts. The pale line here is just where the division of the page is. We are going to basically be covering this time period here that you see with the life of John the Baptist and Christ. And then the next week we'll be covering, the next time we'll be covering Herod Agrippa the First and Agrippa the Second. And then we'll be dealing with, we might just do Agrippa the First, and then the second one is going to be Agrippa the Second and the Jewish War, and so on and so forth. So it's a short period of time, but a lot is happening. In this, you'll see the order of where the books are, the New Testament books are written. I also have a chart, if you guys took I didn't print it out because a lot of you took the Paul class, but I have a timeline of Paul's life with all of the books that he wrote and when they fell, and so I can print those out as well if you want. So, we are at this point starting under the reign of Caesar Augustus. So Augustus calls for another census of Judea. There was a census at the time of Jesus' birth. That census is somewhat debated because Luke says that it was done during the governorship of Quirinius. And Quirinius may have served multiple governorships. And so some have seen this second census as conflicting with Luke 2, but it's actually Luke himself who brings up this census again in Acts 5:37. So Luke knows that there's two of these censuses. Now, you might say, well, what do we do? Because they don't have anything about an earlier census and so on and so forth. Well, you're going to see in just a little bit, they never had anything about Pontius Pilate, so people questioned whether he ever existed. Then we found that it was proven that he did exist. Not everything is exactly recorded, and we can't find records of everything. And so that doesn't prove anything at all. The earlier census was probably carried out by Quirinius as well. Somebody like that would have had positions and been known as, somebody who was familiar with this area and this region and this culture, so it wouldn't be shocking if he was asked to do that twice. The censuses were something that caused issues with the Jews, and so they may have tried to pull off a census at one point and then had to delay it because it became a major conflict. In fact, later on, the second census under Quirinius, is going to be the beginning of the rebellion against the Romans. And so that's why it becomes significant. You guys have any idea why they would have such an issue with the census?
Because of what happened with David counting his soldiers?
Okay, so they probably had some conviction about that with David counting the soldiers and had taking a census of Israel, where they felt they should never take a census of Israel. So there were some that most certainly would have felt that way. But the rest of them probably would have joined easily onto that religious reason, because census just meant they knew how to tax you and knew what taxes were going to be coming. And so that's a big part of why that became an issue. And so it's during this census, which is not the second census, that a Jewish man from Gamla rebels over the census and begins the party of the Zealots. And we're going to talk about this Zealot party in just a little bit. And so up to this point, one reason that's important, up to this point we've been talking about how the Romans have been allies of the Jews, and the Jews and the Romans got along, and they were actually partners in many things. And that relationship is now changing during the reign of Tiberius because of these incidences. So you have a governor, we're told, from AD 9 to 12. We don't hardly know anything about him. Nothing is really recorded. And other than his name may have been Amphibulus instead of Ambivius, it's just how spelling and everything changes. And then Annius Rufus, he was in office when Augustus dies on August 19th, AD 14. Probably why the month is called August. And then he is replaced when the new emperor Tiberius comes to power. So who is Tiberius? Tiberius Julius Caesar. His mother divorced Claudius Nero and married Caesar Augustus. Marcus Vespasianus Agrippa was originally the heir apparent, not Tiberius. But Agrippa ends up dying, and that puts Tiberius next in line. Now, Agrippa is the one who was friends with Herod the Great, and so that he was actually in line. It was either him or his son that was in line to take that position. Tiberius was, when he came to power, he had been a general, he had been a good general, he had led his men, and he was powerful. When he came as an emperor, he was terrible. But not necessarily for the reasons you think. You think he's like overly overbearing and a tyrant. That's not what he did. He didn't really seem to want to be Caesar. And so he actually very soon just retired from Rome entirely, moved to the island of Capri in AD 26, and didn't do anything. He didn't attend the Senate, he left his right-hand man named Sejanus, who was the commander of his Praetorian Guard. He left him back in Rome to govern and do everything for him, and he just relaxed on the island. Now, why would he do that? Well, these are two pictures from the island of Capri, so you can kind of tell why he might want to be there. It is a very beautiful place, and so he had a palace there. But this led to some deep instability within the Roman Empire, because Sejanus, as his, this right-hand man, gained more and more power and authority, and he eventually gets to where he thinks he can overthrow Tiberius. Now, as he gained more power, he was kind of one of the first ones within the Roman government that had a strong anti-Jewish bent to him. He was not a fan of the Jews. He expelled the Jews from Rome. He persecuted the Jews in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria, Egypt, was almost 1/3 Jewish, But the dominance of the Jewish within the government of Alexandria, Egypt, caused a lot of tension with the people that were of different ethnicity. So the Egyptians and then some of the Greeks and stuff that lived there in Alexandria, there was a lot of tension with the Jews. In fact, they constantly are going to Rome and fighting, with each other, asking Rome to intervene. Josephus has an entire book. He's got Josephus' Jewish Wars, Josephus' Antiquities, and he has Josephus against Apion. Apion was one of these Greeks from Alexandria trying to get the Jews to not have as much power in Alexandria, and then Josephus is responding and countering that. And so this issue of Jews in Alexandria was actually a big headache for the people in Rome. And Sejanus had sided with the others against the Jews in Alexandria, which made for some difficult times for them. And Sejanus then is the one who probably actually appointed Pontius Pilate. So Tiberius was not appointing governors. That was Sejanus, although technically paperwork would show Tiberius appointed him. But it was actually Sejanus. Now, this seems to hint that Pilate comes in with an anti-Jewish bent as well. And when we see what he does when he comes to power in Jerusalem, you'll see that yes, that probably was the case. So Sejanus plots to overthrow Tiberius. He tries to marry into Tiberius's family, and that doesn't work out. There's one that he's trying to marry, and that person ends up dying. Tiberius has a son that is favored, Drusus, who he was planning on passing it down to, and Sejanus actually seduces Drusus's wife, I think her name was Livia, and gets her to poison him slowly so that Drusus dies seemingly of natural causes, and then that way he's in line again. And so he actually, toward the end, there's three more. There's Drusus's son is one of the possible heirs, and then you have Gaius, who becomes Caligula, and then there's one other. And Sejanus actually takes the son of Drusus and the other than Gaius, and takes them and imprisons them, and they end up starving in prison. So Gaius is really the only one out of those that really survives. And then there's another son of Drusus who, well, we'll get to that later. So Tiberius finds out that Sejanus is plotting against him and trying to overtake him. Interestingly, in the Roman historians, this little section of, I don't know if it was Tacitus, but it's one of the Roman historians, it's missing. So we don't know how or what happened, like how Tiberius found out from them. The only place that it's actually recorded is Josephus, and Josephus records that it was actually, I want to say Tiberius's wife that comes and tells him, you need to realize this is going to collapse on you because Sejanus is going to take over. And so, Tiberius sends this letter to the Senate, and it calls Sejanus in, praises him for a bunch of stuff, gets into a bunch of just nonsense, and then suddenly says, Sejanus is guilty of this, put him to death. And they've surrounded the building, and so they take Sejanus into custody, and that night he is strangled to death, and his body is thrown out onto the steps of one of the prominent buildings there in Rome, and the crowds tear him to pieces. So he wasn't well loved by that at any means. This also brings out, if Pilate had been appointed by Sejanus, and Sejanus was anti-Jewish, and then now suddenly falls out of favor, when the Jews during the trial of Jesus say to him, you need to do this, or you're not a friend of Caesar's. Now that term, friend of Caesar, is an official title granted to you, and by threatening that would be like, we're going to report you to Caesar as not being a friend of Caesar, and he was already on really shaky ground. And so you'll see when in the trial of Jesus, once they say that, Pilate's like, I'll have to wash my hands. You guys have to. It's over. And up to that point, he's trying to let Jesus go. But once they make that accusation, it's done. And so that probably was due to this issue. And it also shows that the Jews knew that and played it and used it as a card against him. So under Tiberius, he had a different policy for governors than Augustus did. Augustus changed governors in the province every 3 years. Now, remember I brought up before the term cursus honorum, which is the process by which somebody moves up the political chain. Becoming a governor was one of those ways that you would move up the political chain. So in Augustus's mind, it was like this is a way to help people continue to move up and get new positions. Tiberius didn't change them. And when he was asked one time, why do you just let the governor stay there long term? He gave this parable of the flies. He says, like there was this sick man sitting outside of the city gate, and he had sores all over his body, and there were flies everywhere. And people would come and try to swat the flies away. And he'd say, no, don't do that. And they're like, well, why? He says, well, these flies are already full, so they're not biting me anymore. If you swat them away, new ones will come that haven't eaten anything, and they're going to start biting me again. And the idea was the governors, when they get to the place, they want to raise money. And they did. When you were assigned the governorship, you used that to gather as much taxes as you could, more than what you needed to pay what Rome was expecting, so that you then gained that money as well. And so by keeping them there longer, they reached a certain point where they weren't trying to graft so much, and they weren't trying to increase above what the last guy was. And so it actually led to some stability. So he started with Valerius Gratus in 15 AD. And Valerius Gratus changed the high priest 4 times during his time as governor. And the very first priest he removed was Annas, who Josephus refers to as Ananus. This is the high priest that Jesus appears to first in the trial. So he had served as high priest, and it's a lifetime appointment. And he had served for a long time. The only one who serves longer is Caiaphas, but he had served for a long time. And so he was highly respected and still somewhat thought of as like the father priest, kind of thing. The one that was, you had Caiaphas, but Annas was highly respected as well, which is why they bring him to Annas first, and then Annas takes him to Josephus. The last high priest that Valerius Gratus chooses was Joseph Caiaphas. And so Caiaphas is in place before Pontius Pilate gets there. And this changing of the high priest was likely a way to gain money. So people paid for the position, so that's why he was changing the high priest so frequently. The fact that Pontius Pilate doesn't change the high priest at all while he's in is actually pretty amazing. So Pontius Pilate, when he comes in as governor, he comes in 26 AD, which at this point Jesus is probably about 28 years old. He first comes in, and when he enters into Jerusalem for the first time, he brings his soldiers in, and they bring the Roman standards into the city at night. Now, the Jews had gained such a strong conviction that you are to have no graven images, no idols in the land anywhere. They weren't even comfortable with those standards being in the land, let alone in Jerusalem. And you said, well, that's kind of overreaction. Well, those standards, they're a pole that had multiple different symbols on them that were for their unit, with the very top one being an eagle. And when they would set up camp, they would take those standards, stick them in the ground, put an altar in front of them, and they burn incense to those. So they worshiped, because there was kind of the spirit or the genius of that troop, and it was seen to protect them, and so on and so forth. And so when these standards were brought into Jerusalem, the Jews protested, and Pilate left, and they followed him all the way back to Syria, saying, "You need to take these out." And when they gathered before him, there was thousands that were there. I think it was, I want to say 6,000, but they gathered to protest. And he comes out and he's like, I'm going to kill all of you if you don't just leave. And they just stopped, and they all bent down and bared their neck, and they said, then go ahead, but we're not leaving until you take the standards out. Well, he couldn't start his brand new governorship executing 6,000 people. And he knew that, and they called him on it. And so he ends up giving in and removes the standards from Jerusalem. But this act that he does shows some of that anti-Jewish sentiment that Sejanus had, and that probably shows why Pilate was the one he had appointed. He also had the Gilded Shields affair. And so Pilate sought to dedicate Roman shields and to hang them in the temple. And the Jews, again, protest this to Tiberius, and Tiberius makes them take them down. Now, this seems to be a move intentionally to turn the broader public opinion against the Jews, because this is an act that would be seen by every other culture in the Roman Empire as a compliment. You have these shields, you want to dedicate them, you're giving them to the god, you're going to have them hung in the temple of the god, and it's like, wow, that's a way to honor them. And so the non-Jews see this and see how upset the Jews get and think, what a bunch of strict I'm trying to think of something, nincompoops, whatever. And they end up becoming more. So there's things he's trying to do to kind of bring out how weird the Jews are. But because they protest Tiberius, he's then ordered to stand down and take him down. Then we have the Temple Aqueduct affair. This one's kind of a little bit more even, in the sense that he took funds from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct into Jerusalem to supply it with water. That's one of the interesting things when you look at a lot of the models of Jerusalem stuff. There are actually multiple aqueducts coming into Jerusalem, which are almost never modeled, partly because we have no idea where they would have gone. But there's this aqueduct that would have come into Jerusalem, and it probably greatly benefited the temple, because the temple needed large amounts of water for washing away all of the gunk from the sacrifices and so on and so forth. And so in his mind, he's helping to build that, and Roman soldiers are building it, but it's Roman soldiers getting paid by temple funds. And so they get really upset that sacred funds are being used for the secular use, even though the temple was the main beneficiary of it. And the crowds gather to protest, and they're forcibly broken up. So this time he does actually kind of come in and crush it with his soldiers. And so this may be what's referenced in Luke 13:1, which is there in your notes, when people ask Jesus about the Galileans whose blood was mixed with their sacrifice. So they may have been there that were protesting what he was doing. The interesting thing about those, the fact that those being Galileans, because Galilee is really kind of where the zealots were stronger, more so than down in Jerusalem. And so this may be almost just an excuse for the zealots to stir up support at this point, but that's why they were probably Galileans. So as we talked about Pontius Pilate, the effect of Sejanus' fall on the trial of Jesus. So Sejanus' patron falls from power in AD 31, which is going to factor in just a moment in our discussion about when the crucifixion was. His fear of uprisings amongst the Jews and reprisals from Caesar are what are used to manipulate him to execute Jesus. And we already talked about the issue of being accused of not being a friend of Caesar. Pilate eventually is removed from power in AD 36. Tradition has him being exiled to Vienna in Gaul, France, which actually would not have been that far from where Herod Antipas and Herodias end up. And some traditions have him committing suicide, and I think I forgot to change this to match what you guys have in the notes, which is some later traditions have him being converted to Christianity. Which I don't think is that far of a fetch. If when we get to the crucifixion and trial, I'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, as I said, some people doubted whether he was even an actual person, and what we found was at Caesarea Maritima, the city that Herod built on the Sea of Galilee. We found this stone, and on that stone it very clearly has Tiberium, which would be, and this would have been probably, Caesar Tiberius, and then Pontius Pilatus, and if you see the uneven letters, because that's how they're uneven there, and then Praefectus Judea. And so Praefectus means governor, so we clearly have evidence he was a governor under Tiberius, and there's his name in stone, which completely removed all of those criticisms. So, now we're on to the ministry of Jesus. One big question historically is, how do we know when his ministry actually was? And the honest truth is, we don't know exactly when his ministry was. It's very, very difficult to do this, but we're going to kind of narrow down and have some level of good certainty. So one way that we use to line up ancient calendars is astronomical events. So comets that are mentioned in different areas with different calendars lets us line up the calendar. Lunar eclipses as well. And so Josephus mentions that there's an eclipse just prior to Herod's death, and that points to an eclipse that was in Judea in 4 BC. So this is partly why we say that Herod died in 4 BC, because we can line up those astronomical events. When it comes to the crucifixion, the date we're going to end up preferring is April 3rd, AD 33. The Gospels don't mention a lunar eclipse on that day. They talk about the sun being darkened, but they don't mention a lunar eclipse. But Christian tradition had that there was a lunar eclipse that same night of his crucifixion, and there was a lunar eclipse that was visible from Judea on April 3rd, AD 33. So those are things that help narrow things down, but nothing. It doesn't prove anything. When it comes down to the sun being darkened during the middle of the day when Jesus was crucified, there's not a sense that it's an eclipse. It could be an eclipse, but that could just be a miracle. We don't really know one way or the other. Also, another thing to help determine when his ministry occurred is to determine the date of his birth. So we know from the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem that Jesus was born while Herod was alive. So if Herod is believed to have died around 4 BC, then you have Jesus having to be born before 4 BC. And this would put the birth of Jesus somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC. And now you say, why 6 BC if he died in 4 BC and so on and so forth? Because some would say the 2 years between his birth and then the wise men talking to Herod, you'd have to account for that. Now, does that mean that the wise men had to be 2 years old, 2 years later? Like when we're coming up on Christmas time, like people argue about the manger scenes, and the wise men, they probably weren't there the exact same time as the shepherds, and no, they weren't. They also weren't at the manger scene kind of thing, or in the stable. But they could have come fairly soon after Joseph and Mary settled into a house and found a place once things calmed down, because they stayed in Bethlehem when they got to there. And so it does not have to have been an entire 2 years. That's kind of, it's possible, but it's not necessary. The star could have appeared 2 years before Jesus was born, and we're not even really told how long ago the star had appeared to the wise men. Herod could have just been, just to be safe, we're going 2 years. I mean, it could have just been 6 months. We're not even told. So the caution there is that sometimes people will bring out, oh, we know this and this and this. It's like, well, there's a lot of things you got to think through, a lot of possibilities where that may or may not have been the case. So, but if he's born somewhere around 6 to 4 BC, then we have to think about, when did his ministry begin? Luke 3:23 tells us that Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry. And so his ministry must be at least 30 years after the death of Herod the Great. Note that by him saying about 30, it could have been Jesus' early 30s, and that could clearly fit about 30 years old. Technically, he'd be 29, and it could be about 30 years old, because Luke is very clear to make it an approximation. And thus, the beginning of Jesus' ministry could fall anywhere between AD 26 and AD 29. Luke 3:1 tells us that John's ministry started in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. John's ministry started before Jesus's, and the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar is pretty widely accepted to be AD 29. So that allows for the 30 plus the lining up with Tiberius's reign. And so the best year to place the beginning of Jesus' ministry is either AD 29 or AD 30, depending on how long after John started his ministry that Jesus was baptized. And he probably then was around 33 when he started. Many see him as being 33 when he died, but it's more likely he was 33 when he started. So the other thing is, what was the length of his ministry? One, we don't know how long John ministered before Jesus was baptized. There's question of how many Passovers were there. And I think actually these last two should be tabbed in. But some see there being 3 Passovers. Others argue that there's 4. 3 Passovers could mean 2 years, because if he starts his ministry just relatively before one of the Passovers, and then he is crucified at the 3rd Passover, so that could just be about 2 years. But then there could be even more than that, so 4 Passovers would be about 3 or more years. And so the length of his ministry seems to be, from what we're looking at with Passovers, between 2 and 4 years. Now, none of that is authoritative, because there could have been 8 and they only mentioned 4. I mean, it's not absolute. But this is just helping us, zero in on what could be the case. So then, there's the length of his ministry looking to be about that long. Then you have what was the date of his crucifixion. So a big part of what helped, or what people lean on for the date of his crucifixion, has to do with the appearing of the new moon. So this is where it gets so complicated in trying to set these things up together, because the Jews worked on a lunar calendar, and the Romans and most of the rest of the world worked on a solar calendar. And so the Jews, their month began as soon as you saw the new moon, and then you would go until the moon disappeared and such. And then you had to add months in to get it to line up with the full year, so the seasons didn't get way out of whack. And so that means that the Hebrew months were going like this back and forth on what we call the Julian calendar, and that's why Easter, even today, Easter can be anywhere from sometime in March to late April, because it's based on that Jewish calendar. Now there's things that have been put out, Sir Isaac Newton, he went through and calculated when the moon would first have been seen, and from the time that it was first seen, the festival had to start on the Sabbath, so it would have to be a Sabbath either before or after, and you had to arrive at a month where you could get the beginning of the feast lining up on the Friday that would match with what the crucifixion was describing, and so on and so forth. And in that method, then, trying to find that out, he came to the fact that the crucifixion either occurred, Newton says AD 33 or 34, and then other scholars have said either AD 31 or 33. If it's in AD 34, it would be if the crucifixion was on a Thursday, which some people have put forward because 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. And so there are some that would take that. Sir Isaac Newton also put out, he claimed, because the because the disciples, were able to roll the grain out, then it had to have been closer to the harvest. So only one time was the Passover that close to the harvest. But then the question is how close do we know how close the example of them rolling the grain was to the crucifixion? It could have been a year ahead of time. I don't know. But the moon is part of what factors in and narrows it down to the 31 or 33, typically what's accepted today. Pilate's capitulation, when accused of not being a friend of Caesar, as we talked about, and his desire to appease Herod Antipas. So the very moment he finds out Jesus was from Herod Antipas's territory, he's like, I'm sending him to Herod Antipas. This seems to point out to a date after St. Janus being dismissed, because otherwise a lot of the stuff wouldn't have been effective, and he probably would not have been influenced as much by those statements. Again, this is not authoritative, but it's still circumstantial stuff that builds towards a date. Now, St. Janus was deposed and executed in October of AD 31, which is too late for it to affect the trial if it was occurring in Passover of 31 AD. So, the last thing that we have to kind of account for is adding up the years of Paul's ministry and conversion shortly after AD 31. Basically, we know when Paul died, and we have him sharing the number of years he was at different places for the most part. And it seems that AD 31 would be, the best date for his conversion, which is why some still favor that, because it's kind of an equal circumstantial evidence to the St. Janus thing. But it still could fit with AD 33, and even possibly for AD 34. Is just you got to squish some stuff within his ministry, and then you got to stop and ask, how do you count a year? Because if you go to some place and you're there from like August until May, you're in 2 different years. But were you there 2 years, or was that 1 year? So that also factors into the complication of that. So, in conclusion, we don't really know for sure, because lining up ancient calendars is notoriously difficult. We don't have enough solid evidence. But the terms of office, and the terms of office for Tiberius, Caiaphas, Pontius, you'd be like, well, you can just line up these 3, but both of them had both Pontius Pilate and Joseph Caiaphas had really long terms. I mean, had Tiberius kept changing the governors, we would have a lot easier time determining how long these things were. But he didn't, and so the conclusion is Jesus' ministry likely ran from sometime in AD 29 until his crucifixion on April 3rd, AD 33. So 3.5 years to 4 years, with the crucifixion being in 33 AD. So, during the ministry of Jesus, what was the political environment? As we talked about Tiberius, he the first part of his reign, which was before Jesus' ministry, was relatively calm. But once St. Janus gets taken out, there's just purge after purge through Rome in the political system, and it causes a lot of fear and uncertainty, and then you have no clear successor. So it actually was a time of relative political uncertainty in the empire. Pontius Pilate had come in. He had stirred up all the anti-Roman sentiment by his anti-Jewish actions, and so you're starting to see at the time of Jesus this stronger anti-Roman push politically, which is why one of his disciples is a zealot, so it's that stuff has already begun to stir up. And then high priest Caiaphas, he's functioning as high priest. Annas is still highly influential. He would have come to power when Jesus was around 20 years old. And Caiaphas would have been of the Sadducee bent, and would have been very pro-Roman. And we see throughout, as it goes in, the priestly class tends to be, I don't know if I'd say pro-Roman as much as they favor Rome because they keep them in power. So within the land, Judea and Jerusalem is predominantly Jewish. The people there are speaking Aramaic and Greek. Greek was still the lingua franca of the day, so if they were trading with the other people in the region, it was more cosmopolitan. It's not like you went to Jerusalem and it was only Jews. There were people from multiple different nations there, and so Greek was spoken frequently. But among themselves, they probably still also spoke Aramaic. Samaria was predominantly Samaritan still. The Samaritans were still a people group at this time. In fact, Samaritans are still a people group today. You can still go there and go to the Samaritan temple and see them do sacrifices. But they most likely were speaking Greek because they were not a one ethnic identity to begin with, and they would have spoken like the Aramaic with the Persians. But when the Greeks came in, and for 300 years, there was no reason for them to hold on to Aramaic versus another because they were from entirely different parts of the world. And so they likely went to speaking Greek as well. Galilee of the Gentiles was actually very cosmopolitan. There were Jews, there were Syrians, there were Greeks, there were others. And almost everybody in that area spoke Greek, and probably few of them at all spoke Hebrew or Aramaic. And as we see, the Roman governor was over Idumea, Judea, and Samaria. Antipas is over Perea, and you'll notice that he had Galilee, and this is why Jesus ends up going to him during the trial. Philip the Tetrarch is there. Remember, he's kind of the peaceful one that we talked about last week, who actually did a good job of governing, but we don't hear much about him. He wasn't controversial or anything. And a lot of Jesus' ministry happened in these two regions, and relatively safe as he went through there without a lot of stuff being stirred up against him at first. So who are the parties amongst the people at this time? So you'll hear about the Herodians. The Herodians are those that supported Herod, the kingship, and having the area be ruled in that way. They were very pro-Roman, and many of them probably Roman citizens. They would have spoken Greek and likely had a knowledge of Latin and probably knew very little, if any, Hebrew or Aramaic. The Hellenistic Jews, which probably made up a good deal of the population. When you talk about in Acts when you have the Hellenistic widows in Jerusalem who are being neglected, there was kind of this, looking down on all the Jews who weren't part of that really, zealous, gotta be strong. But that was actually the majority of the people. You think about today, when you look across America, is it the majority of the people that take the religion really seriously, or is it the majority of people that just kind of, and they're kind of Christian in name or whatever? It's the same thing. You have at this time many who would, the Hellenistic Jews, they'd be kind of secular Jews. Some of them probably had some level of, converting almost over to Greek religion, but they for sure had converted over to Greek culture. So you would have seen shaved faces, exercising in the gymnasium, going to the theaters, and so on and so forth. What we would today maybe call you're westernized. And so you might say, like, if you're in modern day Israel today, Herodians would be like the pro-American Jews that are there in the land. The Hellenistic Jews would be like the westernized European Jews that were not, really serious about their faith, but have still moved back. And then the Sadducees would be more like I don't know if you'd say it would be more like the Hasidim or the what do we call the Orthodox Jew, but probably more like the liberal Jew and those that are in the government, and then the Pharisees would have been like the what did I just say? Not the Hasidim, the Orthodox Jews. So Pharisees would have been like the Orthodox Jews. So Sadducees, they're we've talked a little bit about what they believe and stuff in earlier classes. here just gets that they're the priestly class. They were more of a high society on average, and they were pro-Roman because the Romans, like we said, kept them in power. And they would have spoken probably Greek in daily life, but known Hebrew and Aramaic while practicing their faith. And the Pharisees, similarly, they're probably the most faithful to true Judaism, and they were probably a larger group than the Sadducees, but not as large as the Hellenistic Jews. And they, within the Pharisees, you probably had a mixture of pro-Roman and anti-Roman sentiment, and a lot of that would have kind of depended on where you were and who the person was. The Pharisees were not fans of the Herods, though, so they would have been, we're for Rome, but we want the Sanhedrin to rule, not for Rome, and we want the Herods to rule. And then they would have spoken Greek in daily life, most likely, but Hebrew and Aramaic while practicing their faith, similar to the Sadducees. And then the last party here is the Zealots. So this group came to prominence, as we talked about, after the census, and likely they pulled from every element of society, because these are people that are stirred up to anti-Roman sentiment through direct personal experience and corruption and things like that, which could happen to somebody from any one of these parties. But as a whole, they probably pulled some from the Hellenistic party, which you think would be more pro-Roman, but the taxation and the control and so on and so forth, they would have, and the Hellenized Jews were more like, we want freedom and we want independence, because that was part of that Greco-Roman, or the Greek influence on them as a culture. And so they pulled a lot from the Hellenistic, and they might have pulled from the Pharisees, or those that would support the Pharisees as well. The Zealots were actually similar to terrorism in the sense that they functioned, they knew they couldn't raise an army and fight against Rome, so they fought by hijacking people and jumping them while they were traveling and taking all of their things and killing them there. So they were trying to cause fear to disrupt the Roman culture and the supplies and everything that was there. So they originally resorted to highway robbery and guerrilla warfare. So Barabbas, who is offered up in place of Christ, was most likely one of these. He had probably led a band of robbers. When it says, he was a notorious robber, well, that's this. It wasn't just he was a cat thief sneaking into people's windows stealing things. He was somebody who had been caught by Rome and imprisoned because he had been attacking them. And this is why Pilate brings him out, knowing that the Jews were jealous of Jesus, and to prove that they were jealous of Jesus, because they were actually against this guy and not in favor of Barabbas. All of because the people in Jerusalem, most of them were Herodians and the Sadducees and such like that, who were more in favor of Rome and not in favor of what Barabbas was doing. And their own personal businesses were being interrupted by things that Barabbas was doing. And so the very fact that they choose Barabbas over Jesus really shows that they did not like Jesus. And so when Felix, the one who Paul goes before eventually, when he is a governor, he does this purge through the whole country of these robbers. And by the way, this is, when it has Simon the Zealot being one of the disciples, he would have probably been part of the party that was either supporting or actually participating in these things. Now, one thing that I don't want to in any way give a thumbs up to the series that's put out, because I know there's too much controversy around it. But The Chosen portrays Simon as actually one of these who's trying to assassinate somebody. And I think that that's actually an accurate portrayal of him. That's what he would have been doing prior to becoming a disciple. And you stop and you think about that, because you've got Matthew the tax collector, who is clearly at that point a Herodian, and you have, it's hard to tell, because some assume that the disciple that is able to get into Caiaphas's house is the Apostle John, and that's how he gets Peter in, and that's who we're talking about. If that's the case, then it could be that John and his family was tied up with the priestly class and stuff like that, if they had those connections. And so you have people from all these different groups, all of them are represented in the disciples that Jesus selects. And that challenges us to think about that and to see that that's who he wanted making up his team. When, however, these robbers were purged by Felix, then you start getting the Sicarii. So the Sicarii start carrying these small curved daggers, and they're basically assassins. They're trained assassins who come up typically within a crowded place during the feast. They come up to somebody who's targeted, stab them, and then sneak away. And so these Sicarii become very prominent. Now, some have said that Judas Iscariot is from Sicarii. The issue with that is the Sicarii do not become quite so prominent until after Felix, which is clearly after Judas is dead. And so in that sense, it may not be accurate. But as this group grew to prominence, it started to stir up more and more oppression, which actually stirred up more and more of the angst against the Romans, which eventually leads to the war between the Jews and the Romans that ends in 73 AD. So, in Jesus, the extent of Jesus' ministry as he traveled, the bulk of his ministry was done up in this northern area. He went all the way up in toward Syria, and at times there's people coming from all around Syria. Syria was the entire province that's north of here, and that province had many people that came down to see him. He went all the way up to the area of Sidon and went down through Tyre. So he was all in this whole area a great deal. And we know that he traveled through Samaria into Judea. We also know he passed through Jericho. So this is basically the region. Now we're never really told much about him going to Mount Carmel. Don't know if they would ever say that to us or anything like that, or about him traveling further south or into these regions along the shore. It really is predominantly in these areas that we see here. So now we have the trial of Jesus and what happens. You gotta excuse some of the cheesiness of this. I got sick of having the Jerusalem model with just bare sidewalk around it, so I came up with really cheesy ways to make it look more real, but it's still cheesy. But I love the way this model kind of brings out how the city would have been laid out. It would have been far more colorful than this, but this is about how it would have been laid out. This area here along the hill, this is the original city of David. This area here was what was added during Hezekiah. And then in the Hasmonean time is when you have this all being developed. And you'll notice it's all Greek architecture. And that's because that's what it was. It was built very much the Greek area of Jerusalem. You'll notice that this here is a theater. It had a full theater. It had a, there's a horse racetrack in here as well somewhere. But it had a hippodrome is what they would have called it. But here is the tomb of David. And so this would have been built up during the Hasmonean times. And the Hasmoneans built a palace right here that was close to the temple. Herod built his palace up here in these towers, and these towers are what became so controversial because you could see into the Temple Mount from those towers. How many of you guys have been to Jerusalem before? I've asked this one time. So if you go to Jerusalem and you go up onto what is called the Tower of David, which is actually built on the foundations of these towers, not by David, you can get onto the top of this tower and you can see right down into the Temple Mount because you're actually significantly higher than the temple at that point. This hill down here, as you walk, today if you go in the Jaffa Gate at Jerusalem and you walk down the main route down to the Wailing Wall, it's a steep slope down there. It's solid steps almost the entire way. Well, it is steps the entire way. And so it's a pretty steep hill, as are all of these. Do you have a question?
Yeah, can you point out the graveside of David again? I couldn't see because you're okay.
So you can see like a tower right there.
Yep. Okay.
So that's what Alexander Janus had pillaged to be able to pay his troops and stuff. And so this is the Last Supper was likely in the upper part of the lower city. So this would be like the lower city, this would be the upper city, but it's in the upper part of the lower city. So it's kind of confusing. And just as a note here, the Kidron Valley right here was very deep. And I, when I'm done, if you guys can remind me, I can bring up a picture that I took that gives you a better sense of with the 3D effect of how you get to that, and it just drops off, and then you can see the village on the other side. It's way in the distance. It's a very steep valley there. So the Last Supper being here, Jesus and his disciples made his way to the Kidron Valley and then to Gethsemane. Now, there's pretty much only two gates that they could have gone to. One being here at the south end of Jerusalem. The other would have been to pass through the Temple Mount. Now, if they went through the temple, the issue with that is you're crossing through the main courts and going out that gate. The thing in favor of this is in John, they depart and they're leaving, and then Jesus starts to tell them, but I am the true vine. And the really nice thing that preaches real well, don't know if it's true, but is that on the front of the temple was all these vines and pomegranates, and he could have been pointing to that and saying, I'm the true vine. However, when you realize that when they went to John the Baptist's home fairly shortly before this, they're already scared of being found out and being put to death. So the likelihood that they would have just marched through the temple courts and hey, hi. But at the same time, in that last week, he did go into the temple in the daytime and proclaim, and they were too afraid to arrest him. But for him to have done that at night, when they could have arrested him there, probably was not as likely. So they likely took the other route around to Gethsemane, and then when he was arrested in the garden, he was brought back. Now, in his arrest, that's where I'm going to grab this. I know I put details in there that aren't on all the slides. In his arrest, it's not Roman soldiers that come to take him. A lot of times you'll see in the portrayals that the Romans are coming and they're wearing all this Roman armor. Instead, this would have been some of the temple guard that, like when you go in the temple and there were Gentiles weren't allowed past a certain point, so on and so forth. There was a temple guard that enforced those things. And then some of this is just a rabble, a bunch of people that have been put together. They're bringing clubs and stuff. This isn't an armed group of soldiers in the same way that we might often think. And so it shows up with this crowd to be able to, because they don't know how many disciples are there with them and whether they would fight back. And of course, Peter does fight back and does the infamous ear chop off. But they show up and they take him captive, and then they bring him to the priest's residence. Now, this is being done during Passover. So because it's being done during Passover, Jerusalem is filled with all the people coming in for the festival. And people like the priests, like Caiaphas and so on and so forth, they would have had different quarters where the priests were, but it doesn't mean that they always lived there or so on and so forth. Annas may not have been living there, but because of the festival, they're all there. And this is why, because it's Passover, Annas is there, Caiaphas is there, Pilate is there, and Herod is there. Otherwise, Herod would not have been there. Herod would have been up in Galilee. Pilate would have been out in Tiberias, or in Caesarea Maritima, and the priest may have been elsewhere. And so in one way, they may have seen that opportunity and decided now's the time to do that. So Jesus is first taken before Annas, and when I highlight this, these are labeled as such, but we don't really know exactly where it's at. And so, so he's taken to the priest's quarters. Annas meets with him first, and then he's taken to Caiaphas. They likely were in the same building. So in other words, they're all there. The priests are there for the Passover. They would have been there like a compound. And so Jesus is not traveling a great distance to go from Annas to Caiaphas, and it may even be the same sense of where Caiaphas was getting ready and getting everybody together, and Annas was just meeting with him ahead of time and trying to get something that they could go into there with. And then during his meeting with Annas, that is when Peter does his first denial and his second denial. And then when they move him over to Caiaphas, this is when Peter does his third denial. And once they decide he is going to be crucified, then they take time to basically abuse him and ridicule him and insult him. Now, do you guys remember what it is that Jesus says that results in them saying, "Surely you're going to be crucified"? Anybody remember? So the high priest says, "I adjure you by the living God, are you the Christ, the Son of God?"
You say that I am.
And he says, "You say that I am," and he says, "And I say to you," and the interesting thing here, we're going to see this just this Sunday, because I'm not covering the trial, but it corresponds with what we're doing this Sunday. He says, "You say that I am," singular, so he's saying to Caiaphas, "You say that I am," or you, yes, what you say is right, "but I say to you," plural, that from here on out you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds in great power and glory at the right hand of the power. And they're like, that's it for them. And so they do that, and then they begin to abuse him. Now, during the time that they're abusing him, they are, this would be when he's going to be struck and mocked and spit on and such, but he's not whipped. And this is one of the things that is, kind of there, especially after the Passion was made, and they have the whole whip with the big shrapnel thing just ripping and tearing at the body. And I remember being told that, and I preached it myself. I was like, man, but if you look at what's actually described, that's not what is put out in the actual passage. He's beaten, but not with the whip in that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. So here he would be abused, and then they decide to take him before Pilate, but they do so in the morning. So this trial with all of them actually takes a good deal of the night. And so then you get to Jesus before Pilate, and they take him to the palace area of where Herod had built his palace, which was likely turned into the area where the governor would be. Now, this is primarily taken from the fact that, I don't know if did I put it in the notes of the next slide. I'm not seeing the notes of the next slide. But basically, it says that they were taken to the palace, which is the Praetorium. So it kind of seems to indicate that Herod's palace has been turned into the Praetorian area by the Roman governors. And so he's taken, and you'll see it's not drastically far. He's taken over to the palace. And then while he's at the palace before Pontius Pilate, and he's taken there, this is when Judas reneges on his decision and decides to hang himself. Now, there are some, and I am open to this for sure, that believe that Judas was actually betraying Jesus because he was trying to force Jesus' hand to reign, to go out and to, and that if he stirred everything up, then Jesus would show his power and he'd just wipe them all out. And so when Judas sees Jesus just being led captive and not responding and now being turned in, he's like, I got this wrong. And then he goes and he throws his money to the priest and then goes and hangs himself. So when Jesus gets before Pilate, it's in the initial investigation that is told to him that Jesus is from Galilee. Now, note that there was much more being said in the trial than was recorded in all of the Gospels put together. And so how much occurred before this, we don't exactly know. But pretty early on, he does send him to go see Herod. Now, Herod was likely staying in the Hasmonean palace that was probably the possession of the Herods, because they were technically the inheritors of the Hasmonean dynasty. But we don't know exactly where his palace would have been. But you'll notice again, it's not really that a huge distance away. And so he goes before Herod, and then when he goes before Herod, what happens to him there? You guys remember? What does he say to Herod?
He's silent before Herod.
That's right, nothing. So here's this Herod Antipas, all the connections, all the political, power. He was not just a small petty king, like we've said. But when he goes before Herod Antipas, Herod's just hoping to see some kind of miracle. He was afraid that he was John the Baptist resurrected. Probably a little bit relief that he looked nothing like John the Baptist. Maybe he did. They were cousins, but it's just he goes about that. Nothing. He doesn't find anything worthy of death. And then he mocks him by putting on this royal robe and sending him back. All this was probably very frustrating to the Jews. They're just blowing them off. They're not really doing what they want. And it says that they were, bitterly arguing, before Herod, and Herod was probably just, laughing at Jesus and blowing them off and having just fun with it. I've seen a few portrayals of Herod that way, and it probably is not that far from the truth. So then when he's done, he sends Jesus back with the robe, and he goes now before Pilate again. And what's interesting is that Luke tells us that as a result of Pilate having sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before that, they were enemies. And so it's I actually had this fun skit I did one time in Youth Group and Road. It's a fun one to do. Maybe someday we'll do it. But it's called A Trial Friendship, and it's about Herod and Pilate explaining how they became friends to somebody. And it's just a retelling of the story of Jesus' trial from that perspective. It's just kind of a fun one. But it's interesting that they, after that time, became friends. And then when they comes back now to Pilate, Pilate is getting ready to speak with Jesus again, and his wife tells him that she has a dream and warns him not to have anything to do with condemning this righteous man. Now, this is why I say I don't think it's too far of a fetch to think that they eventually became Christians. I mean, if his wife had this strong impression this was a righteous man and this was somebody you shouldn't have, and I had this dream and I had this thing, and then he's doing everything he can to wash his hands of it, and you think of having Jesus stand before you and answer your question of what is truth, and have him to stand there with that confidence and the presence and everything else like that, and then to know 3 days later that you put a seal on that tomb and that tomb's empty. I don't think it's too far of a fetch to think that eventually, they may have become Christians. I think it would be absolutely cool to get to heaven and find that out, because you talk about the forgiveness and the grace of God. That would be amazing. But after he's warned by his wife, he seeks to have Jesus released. It's hard to tell exactly the order, but at some point he has Jesus beaten just as a punishment, in hopes that it will be enough to get them to let him go. And so John tends to be the one that seems to portray more of like he beats him and then shows him to the crowd, whereas others say that he shows him to the crowd and then he's beaten. But what happens in the beating with the Romans he sends him back, and it's a Roman cohort. You guys remember from our lesson a while back how big a Roman cohort is? It's about 80 guys. So, and it says the whole cohort. So this isn't just a part of them. It's like, so there's 80 guys coming in, taking their time, bowing down to him, laughing at him, spitting on him, hitting him in the head, but they're hitting him in the head with a reed. So John is the one who uses this kind of the word that he's flogged. But that word flog actually in the original language can mean disciplined and beaten in different ways with different, it doesn't say, it's not like specific to what element is being used to beat. The other three gospels make plain that he's being hit with a reed. And so it's something that would have been very stinging and would have hurt and would have everything, but it's not the what they call the cat o' nine tails that has pieces of glass that rip in and so on and so forth, which inspired the movie The Passion. And so in that sense, I don't mean to do that to lessen the what happened to him, and it was equally painful. It just was a different sort of what is happening at this point. And so they're making fun of him. They take the robe that Herod gave them. At least it seems that it's that same robe. They put it on Jesus. And then they're the ones that wind together the crown of thorns. The Romans are. And they put it on his head. And they're going around hitting him and asking him to predict who's hitting him and so on and so forth. Then when this is done, Pilate brings him back out. And in John's gospel, what ends up happening is he brings them back out. And he's like, isn't this sufficient? And they're like, no, he has to be put to death. He's like, well, why does he have to be put to death? Well, he claims to be the Son of God. And now Pilate panics. Because, and he might say, well, why would Pilate panic? He's a Roman. Well, the Romans and the Greeks believed that the gods had different children that they had through people. And if you think that the Romans and the Greeks at this point weren't superstitious, they're extremely superstitious at this point. And the fear that this is a favored son of a god that he's abusing, he is very scared at this point because he's now looking at divine retribution that he is afraid of. And so he brings Jesus back in and like, who are you? You know, where are you from? Jesus just doesn't answer him. And the thing is like, what would have happened if he had said, you know, this is who I am? I mean, because he had to go to the cross, but he couldn't lie and go, yeah, I'm just nobody, go ahead. I mean, so anyway, so he doesn't answer him. And so then you have Pilate bringing him out, trying really hard. I want to let him go. And this is when the Jews then say, if you let him go, you are not a friend of Caesar. And then he says, well, this is your king. And they say, what? We have no
King other than Caesar.
We have no king but Caesar. And so then he those two statements, you're not a friend of Caesar, we have no king but Caesar, and so he has to do it at that point. And that's why he does the washing of his hands and pushes them on and allows them to crucify Christ. Now, when he washes his hands and does this final speech, it says that it's at Gabbatha, which is the place of the pavement. And this is why when you see this area here that's modeled out, and I don't know how accurate this is. I don't know exactly where they got the evidence to build this whole Jerusalem model, but it would have been something like this, a very broad pavement area in front of the palace that he was in, where he could have pronounced this, and so the crowd would have been out there, and they would have been crying, crucify him, crucify him. So at this point then, when they took him with the Praetorian, they may have taken him back into this area. It may have been part of the other palace here. We don't know exactly where that is. And some believe it's the fortress. I'll show you in the next slide. But because it says, like in the one passage I shared with you guys, the palace, which was the Praetorian, I don't believe it's the other fortress. So the crucifixion, the Via Dolorosa, that is probably more likely is if you started at the Jaffa Gate today and headed north, which is actually hard to head north and still get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but that would have been more the Via Dolorosa. Now the traditional, if you go today to Jerusalem, the traditional Via Dolorosa is going to come from here, and this is where some people think that was the Praetorian. So the traditional Via Dolorosa would follow more of a path of this sort. Now, you look at this, you see this wall coming down, and so some people are like, well, this isn't where Golgotha is because it's inside the wall. Not at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. This wall is built later, before the Romans come to attack, and so this outer wall is not there. So this was still outside of that wall. When it says that Simon Cyrene is asked to carry his cross, it's interesting because in the first three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, it's almost like it's right away. That as soon as they walked out, that they grabbed Simon Cyrene and made him carry the cross. John specifically says that Christ carried his own cross. And so this is why you see the mixture of Jesus beginning to carry the cross and then dropping it, and then Simon Cyrene being brought in. Now, because it says that Simon Cyrene was coming in out of the country, in other words, outside the city, it is likely that that would have happened closer to the gate, that as he's coming into the city, they're coming out of the city, and that's likely where that would have happened. After the crucifixion, he was buried very nearby in the tomb, and so this is the traditional Via Dolorosa. There's a very tall rock, which is why it's here on the model, and this is why if you walk into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre from the south, which by the way, if you ever go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, it's very hard to figure out because it's like, it doesn't even feel like a separate building. You're like walking through these gates, and next thing you know, you're in this courtyard that looks no different from the other courtyards, and then you walk through the door and you're in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's just, it's very hard to distinguish from everything around it. But when you do walk in, there are stairs that go up on the right. They go up to the top of this tall rock that is there. And then there's a place where you can reach in, and there's a hole, and they say that's the hole that the cross was put down into. And then you would descend the stairs from there. You'd walk down a really long hallway and down a bunch of other stairs, and then walk back around, and then you get to where the tomb is. And so the tomb is relatively close, which is exactly how the Gospels portrayed it. Now, some people say, well, that's not, Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not where it was. The issue with that is that it is likely where it is. We just don't like it because it's been covered over with a version of Christianity we don't like, with rosaries and incense and everything else like that. But it likely is the location, because what happened after Jerusalem is destroyed, the Christians still venerate the place where the cross was. And when the Romans completely take over Jerusalem in like 115-ish AD at the Bar Kokhba revolt, there's Christian things established, and they intentionally built Roman temples over them to desecrate those sites. In so doing, they preserved the location of where the crucifixion actually was, which was discovered by Constantine's mother, who then built the church, tore down the temple and built the church there. So it is actually very likely that this is the actual location. It's just, you don't like it when you're there, if you're a Western evangelical. Yeah.
I'm all confused with this picture, and I was there. I thought it was the hill of Golgotha.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that we looked at a hill that we stood away from and saw it at a distance.
So you were looking at Gordon's Calvary, most likely.
So it's just a different place that they say it happened.
A lot of Western evangelicals just don't like the way the worldwide church has decorated the Holy Land.
Okay.
I don't know how else to put it. Like, you get there in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, like I said, you've got You've got incense. Sometimes it's even gaudy, and there's all these candle things hanging down.
Catholics are gonna be in
Yep.
heaven too.
Yeah, some.
Catholics, yeah.
But
They're gonna be in heaven too.
they,
Some
but
Catholics.
because you go in and they have the stone where they prepared his body, and they rub their rosaries on it and stuff. And so when you're there, it's kind of, as a Western evangelical, you're like, this isn't how I picture it. This isn't what I see. And I don't think. And if you go where the tomb is, they've taken down the cave around it, and you just have the slab. And so, and they've turned it into this ornate thing. So the
So it was actually much closer to the temple wall than
Oh,
what
yeah.
we went, where they took us
Yes.
to see it.
yes. Did you guys go to the Church of Holy Sepulchre?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like I said, it's not it's not as scenic and not like what we picture it, but it probably is the actual location. So in the
This is, or what we
this is
saw?
this is
Okay.
the tomb that they take you to. It looks nicer because it has the stone and the cave, and looks like you can roll away. So it looks nicer. It looks like your phonograph in Sunday school, but it's probably not where it was.
So the skull, is that rock what they called the skull then?
Right, yeah. There is almost no evidence whatsoever that Gordon's Calvary is like the place of the skull, just because you look and you see, I think I can see a skull face, in there, and so on and so forth. This rock, by the way, if you do go into the Church of Holy Sepulchre and you can touch it, as you come down, because you're coming in from the south. My brain, I'm like a guy, so I gotta be north. So, but you come in from the south, you go up, you touch it, you come down, you have to walk around this way, and as soon as you walk around, there's actually a big glass case with the side of this rock as well. So you can tell they do that to show that the rock that you're touching up at the top up here drops all the way down. So it is a hill of Golgotha. It's something that's stuck, and you got to realize that church is built over it. So the rest of the way that hill would have continued on down has been flattened for the sake of the church. So it is what it claims to be. The other thing is that this location would have been right on the main road going into Jerusalem, where everybody would have seen it, especially during Passover. And that was the point of crucifixion, was hang them out and let everybody see. So very likely that this is the location. But let me step back to this last one here. The words of Jesus on the way to Calvary. It says, but turning to them, Jesus said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming, when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it's dry? Now, that's not often brought up during, the season of celebrating the death and resurrection of Christ. What is, of all the things to say as he's on his way to the cross, like not, don't worry, grace is coming, don't worry, you're gonna, why does he say this? What do you guys think? And what is he talking about?
Because if they're evil now, it's just gonna get worse and worse.
Okay.
And he's also talking about the 70 AD destruction of the temple too.
Exactly, and the reason why I bring that up, for like in the men's group, we're going through Revelation, and there's the different views of Revelation, and I just so you know, I have not landed on one of these views, and I'm not, it's not like what I'm about to tell you is like 100% my view, because it's difficult. But when you wonder like how could we think that Revelation is talking about the 70 AD thing, Jesus here very clearly is talking about that, and he uses this fall on us and the hills cover us, and the place where that's repeated again in Scripture is Revelation 6:16. What we often, because we get to the crucifixion, and what we always put out is he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Who do you guys think he was talking to at that point? They're talking about He wasn't talking about the Jews. He was talking about the Roman soldiers who were nailing him to a cross and then bedding over his garments. He knew, and when it comes to the Jews, this is what he's saying to them. This is what he says to Caiaphas. It's like, you've rejected your Messiah. My punishment is going to come. There actually is a vengeance that is coming upon them. It's actually the Gentiles who had no way of knowing who this Messiah was, no way of understanding it. And when he says forgive them, what do you think he is meaning by forgive them? What happened if, when God forgives those that are nailing Jesus to the cross, what effect does that have? Does that mean that they're now saved and they're going to heaven? I mean, what does that mean when Jesus prays that?
It's not going to be held, that specific thing will not be held to their account.
Right. Now, what you have is the Jews who are doing this, they have, by prophecy and by fulfilling that prophecy in their own hearts, they have hardened their hearts and committed the unforgivable sin. They attributed what was the very Spirit of God right in front of them, loving and speaking the very words of God, and they said, that is evil, that is of Satan, and they will not be forgiven. So there is no way for them to be forgiven, that they have been hardened, and the judgment is going to come. For these who are doing this, it's like, Father, forgive them. It's, in other words, it's don't, as a consequence of them having been the exact ones who crucified me, don't harden their hearts so that they can't come to me. And so it's almost, the forgiveness here is probably more of a sense of God not disciplining the very ones who are crucifying him so that they actually could become Christians. The centurion right there ends up believing, and there's probably a good chance. I believe Christian tradition has that a good amount of those involved in the crucifixion came to faith. I think it would be amazing to get to heaven and find that out as well, because again, what they witnesses and what they're seeing, and then they would, when the resurrection happened, not everyone's going to believe what they said about the tomb, especially the very soldiers who had to guard the tomb, talking to the other soldiers who had helped crucify him, and that would have made a huge impact. But what I want you guys to catch is with these words on the way to Calvary and with what is said, is that there is a sense of where, as Jesus goes to Calvary and in his trial, when he says to Caiaphas, you have said that, and then says to all of them, from now on, all you're going to see is me coming with power and great glory and vengeance. You're going to see in both the passage this week a mention of that vengeance and a mention of that vengeance in the trial. And because we've kind of gotten so caught up with the Father forgive them, they know not what they do, we don't see that part and realize there was an actual act of vengeance on those who crucified Christ, who should have known better because they were Jews and had been given revelation to that effect. So, on the back of this, just because of time, I'm not going to go over it, but I figured you guys could have it as a resource. It's just kind of my best effort at a chronology of the post-resurrection appearances. And we'll start next week with the whole area of Acts, but we got about 10 minutes, 12 minutes if anybody has a question that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, dude, real quick, on the on this last part you're talking about, they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. You said that this is really related to the 70 AD incident, which I believe is related to the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. What evidence do you have that this is specifically related to that event?
It's not so much an evidence that, this has to... There are arguments that would say, no, this is the end of the world. Mm-hmm. Sorry, the end of the world. There are arguments that says, no, it's talking about the 70 AD. It's the same thing you're going to hear when we get to Matthew 24 and so on and so forth. The key thing is this. In the passages that talk about, falling upon us, when in passages in Matthew 24, when you see the abomination of desolation, it gives you a place to flee. It gives you, a place to go kind of thing in the Matthew 24 passage. And so there is this sense of a local destruction. The fact that he's saying to them, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves as Jews, because this is coming. So it's not weep for the world. This is weep for yourselves, because if you think this is bad what I'm getting, you just wait until this gets really bad and what's going to be brought. And so there's a strong argument for it, but nothing that can be said like for sure. There's people of a different theological bent that would say, no, this is not, definitely not speaking about 70 AD. It's talking about the future because it matches with the text of Revelation, and Revelation has to be future. So depending on what your background is, will determine that. And I'm, when I share with you, I'm like, somewhat sure of this, but primarily because within the Gospels, and we especially see, even though this quote's not from Matthew, but other ways in Matthew is aiming at this. I mean, the very last thing that Jesus teaches is the destruction of the temple in 78, that Matthew 24 passage, and then telling them there's going to be a long time till he comes back. And the very next thing is now we're going into the trial. And so Matthew aims his whole gospel at it, and is going toward that. And then you begin to understand when Matthew's whole goal is to show that the church is supposed to be a great deal Gentile, and that this Judaizing that Matthew is seeing in the time he's writing the gospel, this Judaizing was not okay with Christ. Christ had condemned that, and Christ had predicted that the church would be of all the nations. And he makes that a goal all throughout his gospel. It's evident in multiple ways. And because that aims at the 70 AD destruction in the end, in the sense of the old covenant, then it makes stuff like this okay, that's why I see it fitting 70 AD, not this distant future thing. But it's that stuff that's been debated by godly people for centuries. So it's nothing short. So,
Okay.
yeah. Dave, you had a question?
Yeah, when Pilate was talking to Jesus, in John 18:37, I'm sure Pilate had to hear about Jesus and what was going on. And after what his wife said to him and how Jesus reacted, he didn't defend himself, and in that last part of that verse it says, "Everyone who is of truth listens to my voice." Mm-hmm. And then Pilate just turns around and he says, "What is truth?" And he turns around. I was always amazed about that, why he would do that. I mean, that seems so illogical to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Pilate may have been aware of what was happening with Jesus, but he had an entire system of living and thinking that was not at all in that line, and he's being faced with something that I think would change his life, but he's in the midst of that while he's talking to Jesus, and he's clearly amazed that Jesus is, so calm, not at all worried about what's going on. And it's often missed just how hard he tries to not crucify Jesus. And that's been more so in the last, definitely more so in the last few years, where anti-Semitism is considered horrible, and the fact that the Jews said, "His blood be upon us and our children," that's been a real political hot potato. And so people have really tried to move away from emphasizing the Jewish responsibility, versus the Romans, and really blame it on the Romans. So, that's where, Pilate definitely was struggling and definitely had issues, and I think Jesus saying that to him did have an impact. And it's just he had a hard time processing it at the moment.
I just think it would have been amazing if he said, "Well, tell it to me." What? And then have that conversation and listen to God speak to him. What what he needed to hear.
He's coming from an entire culture where what is truth? Truth is what power makes it. Yeah, and so there isn't really that truth. So he's having to process that, because that's definitely out of left field for him. So.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right. Have a good week. We'll see you next week.
Like it's Gordon, old trip.